Behalf God's tactic. Behalf God's tactics. Behalf God's covert tactic. Behalf God's covert tactics. Behalf God's overt tactic. Behalf God's overt tactics. Behalf God's indirect tactic. Behalf God's indirect tactics. Behalf God's direct tactic. Behalf God's direct tactics. Behalf God's soft tactic. Behalf God's soft tactics. Behalf God's firm tactic. Behalf God's firm tactics. Behalf God's hard tactic. Behalf God's hard tactics. Behalf God's beginning tactic. Behalf God's beginning tactics. Behalf God's middling tactic. Behalf God's middling tactics. Behalf God's ending tactic. Behalf God's ending tactics. Behalf God's private tactic. Behalf God's private tactics. Behalf God's public tactic. Behalf God's public tactics. Behalf God's silent tactic. Behalf God's silent tactics. Behalf God's written tactic. Behalf God's written tactics. Behalf God's photo tactic. Behalf God's photo tactics. Behalf God's audio tactic. Behalf God's audio tactics. Behalf God's video tactic. Behalf God's video tactics. Behalf God's past tactic. Behalf God's past tactics. Behalf God's present tactic. Behalf God's present tactics. Behalf God's future tactic. Behalf God's future tactics.